Hey everyone, welcome to Talks at Google. I'm Matt Bonjovi, and I'm delighted to be welcoming as our guest for today, Harry Parker. Harry is an author and artist whose new book is Hybrid Humans, Dispatches from the Frontiers of Man and Machine. It tells the stories of those who are living on the interface between human biology and cutting-edge technology. Harry's book weaves these individual stories into a larger discussion on what it means to be human and how technology is changing that definition. Hybrid Humans also details Harry's own journey. He joined the British Army when he was 23 and served in both Iraq and Afghanistan. His life changed overnight when he lost his legs to an improvised explosive device. He now wears prosthetic legs, a piece of technology he relies on for mobility, and which has also led him to examine and grapple with a new identity as a hybrid human. Now, throughout our discussion today, you might have some great questions coming to you, and when you do, please go ahead and add them to the chat on the right. We will have time shortly for Harry to answer some of these, so be sure to get your questions in early. But first, Harry, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks, Matt. Thanks for having me on. It's really great to be here and really excited to be on Talks at Google.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, so you use this term hybrid humans in your book, and I'm wondering if you could start by telling us what you mean by this term.
Yeah, so I went from this quite sort of regimented existence in the military where we all had to be really physically fit and we had to train together to achieve missions and all that sort of stuff. And I think I came from an environment where physical fitness and everything that came with that was very important. And then in an instant when I was injured in Afghanistan, I went into a completely different environment of being an injured person and had to learn to walk again. And in that process, I went from broken body in a bed, completely immobile, with tubes and pipes coming out of me, keeping me alive. And then I went along this sort of spectrum of disability, essentially through wheelchair, first very rudimentary prosthetics, mechanical prosthetics, and then onto the more high tech sort of microprocessor needs that I have now. And in that sort of recovery and rehab journey, there was also a sort of psychological journey about who I was, my identity, and how I was interacting with those sort of rehabilitation technologies. And there was also this word of disabled, disabled person, and it didn't really seem to fit with my experiences of the world. It felt quite negative, and I think a lot of disabled people feel the same. And on top of that, there was I think there's a sort of origin story thing, a bit like the movies, the superheroes have an origin story. And I think if you've acquired a disability, in like a shark attack or in Afghanistan, something that's quite sort of a major event that has a narrative and a story you can talk about, it's also then you sort of don't want to be labeled with something that is negative. And I think I was looking around for a better way of describing myself. And there are other injured soldiers out there who sort of describe themselves as bionic or cyborgs or differently abled, and they all sort of didn't quite work for me. So I sort of stumbled across this idea of sort of hybrid human. I really liked it because it has that humanity in it. But I should just say before we move on that actually Hybrid Humans, the book, really charts, it's quite a long journey that I'm sort of writing about. And by the end of it, I'm much more at home with the idea of disabled. And especially in the UK, and I'm sure in the US, that there are, people have fought for that term, and it's sort of a legal right now that gives us lots of, legal rights and opportunities. So it's sort of a double-edged thing. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. And it seems like woven into this term and the sort of identity that comes with it is an understanding of what it means to have part of you be not necessarily human, quote unquote human, the hybrid part of that. And in your book, you kind of have this analysis where you look at by mass, your sort of 12% machine. What impact does that have on how you interact with the world?
Well, I think it's sort of, I've thought about this so much, this idea that without my prosthetics, hang on, I'll just show you. So this, it'll beep now, but this is my prosthetic. And it's beeping, telling me how much battery I got. But this is the prosthetic, this is the microprocessor, and then I have these sort of blades on, and I've got another one on the other side, just to give everyone a bit of a visual. But so without them, my experiences of the world with and without them are completely separate. I mean, if I take them off, obviously I'm either on the floor, sitting on the floor, or I'm in a wheelchair. And actually, I don't really use a wheelchair anymore. So just in that sense. And if anyone is out there who's listening who's been in a wheelchair, that gives you a different perspective and idea and interaction with other people, just in terms of the height you're at or how you access buildings. And it's same with prosthetics, but obviously because of the way prosthetics work, they put us again at a similar height as the people around us. So I often describe it that the prosthetics are really key to who I am and how I feel, and I feel differently without them and with them. And if I meet someone and talk to them, I'm not wearing them, it feels different somehow. And I think that there's lots in that in terms of how I sort of embody them, how they feel part of me, and also in terms of my identity as well. So that's a really important part of the legs.
Yeah, and you also talk about how there's sort of the physical integration that has to happen of this technology with your physical body, but then there's also more of a personality integration that needs to happen, where you can make these things match not only your physical body but also who you are and your personality. How important is this second integration of making that technology match kind of who you are and who you feel that you are?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. So as you saw from my legs, I'm happy to walk around with shorts on, and I do that for lots of reasons. My grandmother, when I first started wearing shorts, was like, "Why are you wearing shorts?" She's like, she's quite English, quite sort of traditional. And so the idea that her grandson was walking around wearing shorts was a bit, I wear a sort of jacket and tie sometimes with shorts on to go to weddings.
So she was more worried about the shorts rather than the actual leg prosthetic.
Yeah.
Right.
She was worried about that sort of what that looked like.
Right.
But I did wear trousers for a while, and what was interesting about that is, I was a young fit guy. I was like 26 when I was first injured, and people couldn't see the disability so easily. So they would sort of look at me, and I would get the sense that they were sort of looking at me going, "Well, why is that young guy limping a bit? Or why is he walking a bit funny?" And I felt embarrassed by that. And I talk a lot in the book about embarrassment and shame and what that means. But I quickly learned that wearing shorts actually made life a lot easier. So, for instance, going on the underground trains, it's in London, there's people everywhere, and if people can't see it, they can't give you more time and space. So there's an element of communication. But so I made a very conscious choice to have the sort of technology very visible. And we talked a bit before the session started about what it means to have sleek technology, and how that sort of, the Hollywoodization of cyborgs and things. But for some people, it's the opposite. They want prosthetics that are cosmetic prosthetics. They're made to look ultra realistic. And this is an expensive bit of kit, this microprocessor knee, but the cosmetic prosthetics are very expensive as well. So that's the sort of other end of the spectrum. And I think both are really valid. And then there's some people I met in the book who are sort of stepping outside what might be human and going beyond that and creating prosthetics that are sort of completely out there, or their sort of wildest dreams. And there's a person I met who had a prosthetic hand created. They have limb difference and a prosthetic hand, and they have a sort of ultra realistic snake going in and out of the hand. Yeah. Not even a tattoo, it looks like a snake. So so there's some interesting stuff happening in that space. So I think that's one part of how we can sort of express ourselves or not with these sorts of prosthetics.
Yeah. And is there a sense that from like the biomedical engineering side that expression and almost like the artistry of it is woven into what's trying to be done? Or is it mostly that there's this effort from doctors and engineers to kind of solve the problem?
I think that's really true. The sort of the one end of the spectrum where people are expressing themselves feels much more artistic and performative. It's much more sort of fringe. But you're exactly right. The sort of the medical professionals in the medical world, it is much more about the problem. And I think often there's a bit of friction there, because it's not necessarily thinking about, not putting the end user at the center of the experience. It's like looking at the problem and the solutions we have, and not putting the end user at the center of what is really required. And I think that people listening will know that goes across lots of technologies. But I think there's sort of identity thing there, giving people the options to have different types of prosthetics and express themselves differently. But there's also the sort of a little bit more hard-nosed sort of control interface, it also linked to that. So, I was given a sort of new algorithm to test in the limb that I've got. And the idea of the algorithm, this was a trial. So the idea of the algorithm was to make the leg a little bit more realistic. And it was, developed by the control engineers, and they designed it, and it essentially allowed you to step over things differently. And it was a clever bit of kit, and it was meant to be more sort of biologically normal, I suppose. Right. But I hated it because it took some of the control away from me, if that makes sense. And so I think especially with sort of the biomedical technologies, putting the sort of user as the center of the experience, the sort of the highest control entity, if you like, is really important, or I think it is. And maybe I'm wrong. Maybe if I'd really tried it and kept going with it and sort of, kept pushing it, maybe I would have got more out of it. But it just made me feel a bit seasick, basically. Right. And I wonder, driverless cars, whether there's something in that, maybe we will all adopt this stuff. But when you're not the sort of center, the highest control entity, I do wonder with some technologies if there's a bit of a danger there that we're less likely to be comfortable with them.
Yeah. And is there something in that comfort where, because you talk about your legs and even like the algorithm in your knee as almost becoming a part of you, does that then make it difficult to want to trial things? Is there almost like a identity crisis that happens every time you try one of these new things, or is it smaller than that? Or
no, well, I think for me, because I'm really lucky, if you're an injured soldier, you get given some of the best kit. So actually I'm sort of, I've got something that is sort of top range. What happens more is when it breaks or needs a service and I have to go onto an old limb. That's really quite shocking in terms of how it feels to then walk around on something which I don't feel like me. It's like walking through treacle or wearing really heavy boots with lead in the bottom. So that's really interesting. And I think I'm slightly going off on a tangent, but what's worrying about that sometimes is if this company that makes my limb suddenly went bust or something, or decided not to make this limb anymore, you start to what I have anxiety about that. And I think especially during COVID and the pandemic, when our National Health Service here, which is brilliant thing, but when it was sort of closed to access essentially for a while, I was thinking, well, what happens if I get an infection or my leg breaks? I can't access those institutions. And you start to realize that although there's nowhere better in the world to live in than a developed country, and with all the sort of the medical help we have, you suddenly realize you're part of a system of systems that's is quite fragile. And just to finish that story, there was a bionic eye, and in the book I look at bionic eyes a bit, but it's called Argos 2, and it's really clever bit of kit, bionic eye, and it allows people to see some quite rudimentary thing, but when you're visually impaired, it is sort of pretty game changing. But that company has decided to stop making that particular device. And when you spent £100,000 with the surgery and all the bits of equipment to get this thing surgically implanted into your head, and then it stops being produced. I mean, think about that in terms of sort of customer experience. It's quite a sort of strange idea to think about.
Yeah, and I think you touched on it there, but you do raise this really interesting point in your book about there's the integration of the person with the technology, whether it's prosthetics or bionic eye or what have you, but then you are additionally connected to this wider network of things, and then almost everything that comes from that, like you mentioned, supply chain issues that are from COVID or a change in the way that the medical service that you use works, or even if your doctor changes, these are really fundamental changes to you that I think a lot of people don't necessarily think about. If they go to their doctor and they maybe see a different doctor one day, it's less of a impact on them. So I think that was quite an interesting point that you raised.
Yeah, and I think that sort of, well, I don't want to overplay it. When I was researching the book, I really wanted to investigate that sort of anxiety when you're so dependent on technology. And so I researched pacemakers, people who have indwelling pacemaker device, because I was just sure that there'd be a load of literature and research about anxiety, about living with a pacemaker. But actually, it turns out that in pacemakers, people don't really feel that anxiety, or the majority of people don't really feel the anxiety about having an indwelling device that's keeping them alive. But I think, for me, how do I describe it? I mean, when my 2-year-old son is running towards the road and I can't run to get to him because my legs have a top speed, there's a certain anxiety around that. Or if I go on holiday to a country that doesn't have the sort of health service that I'm used to, that there is an anxiety for me there, and that does stop me traveling abroad to places that I might want to go or do things. And so I think it is real. It is real for me, certainly. And I think we sort of. I think if you don't know that, but we were talking before about sort of. I made the analogy in the book about the contact lens that a lot of people might be familiar with, and actually, my relationship to my prosthetics is actually quite similar to contact lenses in terms of the sort of day to day. You stick it in your eye, and some days it goes in fine, and you sort of forget about it. But other days it goes in and it's hurting, and there's a bit of grip behind it. And if you go on holiday and you forget to take your contact lens solution or your contact lenses, there's that you're like, oh well, how am I going to find some contact lenses with the right prescription? And of course, it's not such an anxiety, but it's very similar, just maybe sort of magnified quite a lot.
Yeah. And I think that point specifically really does bring it home, for someone like me who wears contacts, and that's kind of the only sort of experience that I have, is you get this kind of sore eye, and you really do, I think, connect with what it must be like for people who are in a situation where there is a further dependence on technology.
But we all can relate to it now with our phones. I know we can back them up, but losing your phone or it not working for some reason, and there's a lot of literature out there. But I do try and make the analogy in the book about how we are putting more and more of our memories and thoughts and sort of delegating a lot more to our mobile devices. And so that sort of anxiety, I think we can also appreciate. I think just going on with the mobile phone, it was really interesting looking at with visually impaired people how, for instance, the iPhone was seen as something which was going to sort of be the end for blind people because it had no buttons. There was no haptic interaction because of the flat screen. But actually, Apple had developed a load of accessibility options that we all know about, voice reader, screen reader, all that sort of stuff. But interestingly, since I was written the book, I was talking to someone about drag and dictate, and they're paralyzed from the neck down, so they're very dependent on drag and dictate. But I'm going a bit off topic here, but I just think it's interesting that drag and dictate you now can't use properly on a Mac, and they're very used to using Mac. So this is a person who's paralyzed who spent 10 years using drag and dictate, which is for people who don't know, it's a voice reading bit of software. And because they were so used to using a Mac, but they can no longer use a Mac, use drag and dictate, because Mac, I think Apple wanted to, introduce their own voice reading software. I think there's something interesting in that it's a bit like the bionic eye, that you sort of think that the progression of accessibility options and this sort of technology is just going to get better and better. But it sort of proves that actually, no, it's not. There are other forces at play, which means that actually maybe everything's not just going to get better and better.
Yeah, and interesting that those forces are not necessarily related to the technology itself, that there are other sort of business decisions and political decisions and all of these things that factor into what is available to people. You also discuss in your book this interesting point about how smartphones have become an aid to a lot of people with various disabilities over even dedicated technology that was intended to sort of solve a specific problem that may afflict a person, but that it's almost like the the general purpose nature of smartphones that help them provide value to people. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think so. So I met a guy who lives in New York called Hayden, and he has a guide dog called Fathom. But we were talking about he used to have, well, he was sort of prescribed 11 or so different devices that could read his post and could do other sorts of functions for him. But now he just says, he's got his phone. He can load it with a load of different apps, and he can hold it over his post, and it can be someone's handwritten writing, and it can read to him who the post's for. So he sort of says, and he sort of said to me, it used to take me an hour to go through the junk mail. He had to get it all out, put it on this sort of computer thing that read it all. But now he can do it in a matter of minutes with an app. And he also talks about to Google Maps, which now he can use to get around New York. But not only that, he can go to a restaurant with his mates, and whereas how many years ago he would have to get one of them to read him the menu, he can now look at the menu on the Google Maps before he's even got there, and that can be read to him, so he knows what he wants to eat. And so I think the sort of that accessibility, which is for all of us, it's been designed for all of us, but is really useful for Hayden as a visually impaired person. And I think there's little things like he says now that he can store 12 audiobooks or more on his phone, whereas when he left university that didn't have the memory. So there's little things like that actually make a significant really significant change for him. And when you've got 11 different bits of quite sort of institutionalized medical kit around you,
right,
and then you've got one tiny phone that can hold all of it, and all this is quite compelling, really. I mean, it's compelling for all of us, but for the disabled people, it really is useful. I mean, I use Siri now or whatever,
right,
to do loads, because probably shouldn't say that, should I? Sorry,
we'll edit it out later.
Yeah, edit that bit. When I use my smartphone, I use
Yeah.
the voice function to because actually typing and walking at the same time, I just fall over or whatever. But if I can just talk to the phone, or write a message by talking, it's pretty powerful stuff.
Yeah. And what does it mean when like the technology that someone is using because of like a physical impairment is also the technology that someone is using just because it's convenient for their workflow or whatever? Does that universality of use like have an impact on like how you feel that you're interacting with the world?
I think there was a lot of stigma around certain disability. So with blind people, a lot of stigma around using certain aids. And I think now the fact that it's all there for you to use. In a sense, the disability becomes less of a barrier between you and other people. So I think that is a really game-changing sort of thing. But I think when you can make a phone universally accessible, it's sort of the same as a building. If you can make a building universally accessible, it's good for everyone. And so it's sort of, I think for disabled people, sort of that's really interesting when the world becomes more accessible, but it's not just about certain things, it's about everything.
Right. Going back a little bit to our discussion about kind of how the medical institutions and the creators of these devices think about the problem that they're solving, is there like, do you see there being any kind of focus on like the physical side of things, as opposed to, you talk in your book a lot about the pain that you've gone through and like the emotional journeys that you had to go through, and even just like the anxiety that you feel day to day? Are those things that are on the inside or maybe less visible, are they also part of the approach that's being taken in these things, or is that sort of secondary to like solve the physical problem and then leave the emotions aside?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's a bit of it's in the book, but I went to a conference on wearable robotics, and it's all about exoskeletons and prosthetics. And there was I didn't understand most of it. Lots of sort of different control approaches and algorithms, and VR robots throwing VR, sort of doing VR, sort of throwing a ball into a bin in a VR environment to try and work out how this robot was walking. And at some level, I was like, why are we so interested in these robots? Surely there's an easier way of doing these things. But I sort of realized that actually, if you can design a robot that can do what humans can do, you can really assist people. So with exoskeletons, in the way that exoskeleton assists the body. But I think at the same time, I sort of was looking at all this huge amount of research in this very sort of quite high end sort of robotics, and just thought, well, you can't attach no one can attach the prosthetic to my leg in a way that doesn't sweat, doesn't rub, doesn't hurt. So it feels like there are certain things that, and it's the same with lots of technologies, but there are certain things that we're quite, we make quite big advances on. But that interface between technology and the body is something that we're still struggling to solve. And in my case, I have the socket, I have silicon liners that I pull over my stump, my residual limb, and then the socket sort of goes onto the limb and gets held on by suction, essentially. So I sort of have this 70,000 pound piece of equipment below that costs as much as a car and has an algorithm in it and all these different technologies and material science that's gone into it over years. And yet the way that we attach it to my leg hasn't really developed so much in like 150 years. And actually, in the book, I meet some people who've done what's called osseointegration, which is where you get rid of the socket, and you essentially drill a hole into the end of the stump that goes into the femur, and you put an implant in, and that implant comes out through the bottom of the stump, out through the residual limb, and you click the prosthetic directly to the skeleton, and it's also called direct skeletal fixation. And what you get is a really good prosthetic interface, because it's attached to you, it's very stable, you can walk around on it, and there's much less pain. But the sort of upshot of it is that there's much more risk of things like infection, deep bone infection, and if it does go wrong, you're left with a sort of implant drilled into your middle of your femur. So it's quite drastic surgery. But for those people who haven't been able to get on with the sort of prosthetics sockets that I use, it can really be life-changing. I mean, one of my friends spent 10 years not really being able to walk properly on normal prosthetics, and then had this osseointegration, and he's up and about and really walking. So for him, that the risks of those sorts of infections and things are worth it. But you look at anything like deep brain stimulation devices or BCUs, brain computer interface units, BCIs, and every time you put those into the brain or into the body, there's always some foreign body reaction. The body starts to wall them off, starts to attack them potentially. There's always the risk of microfilms and infections forming around the devices. So we're getting much better at putting them in, and we're getting much better sort of hybrid solutions where there's in sort of electrodes that are implanted with biological sort of stem cells, so that the body can, neural tissue can grow into the interface. So we are getting better at it, but it's still very much, there's all risks around it, and you'd only do it if it's a therapeutic solution that's worth it. Right. And I think sometimes, and we're sort of coming back to answer your question, Matt, in quite a long-winded way, but I think sometimes we look at the sort of the science fiction and the slick bits of grey kit, and we don't sort of necessarily see those realities of the user living day to day with those sorts of risks and pain, and so I think that's why, when sort of Elon Musk is talking about Neuralink, the sort of neural lace and things like that, I think you're mad, because for me it feels so far away,
Yeah, and you were touching on it there, but so like the mechanics of your specific prosthetics are, you have sort of like almost like a cup, and then your limb goes into that and it suctions on, and then presumably there's a lot of issues around that needing to be a perfect seal, and there being like slight movement, and you were mentioning that it gets kind of hot and sore, and that's all kind of the reality of the situation.
Yeah, I can just take one of them off and show you. But
yeah,
It's turned into show and tell. Sorry.
Yes, yeah, no, sorry.
That's my other leg. For my
Right.
so I'm a below knee, but for this one, I essentially wear a liner with a pin that comes out the end,
Right.
and then the
And so
pin
you
goes.
have the biological knee there, so this goes below the.
Yeah, so this is a below knee. So I'm really cheating for all those bilateral out there. But this is the sort of silicon liner, and then this is just the I go for quite an extreme foot.
Right.
Quite unusual for people because not much. It's very hard to balance on them, but I get a lot of mechanical energy from this. So it's one of those things where I have to sort of, well, I don't really like the way it looks, but the benefit of how it allows me to move around the world is sort of far outweighs that. So
Yeah.
and then it just hangs off. But it's actually, even though this is all carbon, it's all quite heavy, and in the summer, coming up to summer and it's hot and it's pretty unpleasant. So there's those sorts of things are tricky. But yeah, the interface, I think, is often the thing that we overlook. And I don't want to make the phone sort of analogy again, but we're talking about everyone's talking about sort of our necks sort of turning into phone users, and that's quite interesting for me, that way that technology can actually impact on the physical body. And I think that's actually, for lots of us is the reality, not just prosthetic users.
Right. And it also seems like there's like a need for a variety of interfaces as well, because obviously like there's different body types and different situations that lots of different people are in. And we have a finite set of technologies that we then try to fit to all of those cases. How does it work as far as like your prosthetic? Presumably there's some sort of mold that gets taken to try and match a seal perfectly to you, but that changes over time, I'm assuming?
Yeah, so with an amputee, you have to be cast because every amputee is different, especially if you're blown up. You can imagine that no one's residual limb looks the same, and you've got the scarring of being blown up. So they take a mold of your limb, and then they essentially, that goes into the workshop and you get a socket created, and it's I get the other one off, but this is the other side. So you can see that sort of only fits me. It'd be very unlikely to find anyone in the world who that fits. And that's the prosthetic knee, the sort of microprocessor knee there. That has the algorithm, the microprocessor and the different sensors that sense the way it's walking, so that I can then adjust the gait for me and works out how quickly I'm going or if I'm going downstairs. So it's a really clever bit of kit. And actually, when I'm without it, if we were walking along chatting, having this conversation, and I was wearing this, it would be fine. But if I was wearing a mechanical knee, especially if we were on any sort of uneven surface or had to suddenly go down some steps, I would have to stop talking, because I think the sort of, maybe because I'm not clever enough, but the sort of cognitive load of that would sort of interrupt our discussion.
Yeah. And then you also kind of mentioned it earlier, where there's this cognitive load, like offloading that we do with our smartphones and letting those things kind of take over a certain amount of our memory and even like how we navigate a city. Do you also see that with, like, you mentioned this algorithm in your knee, where is there a certain amount of offloading that you're doing to that? And then does that affect how you think about the knee and the knee algorithm?
Yeah, I think so. So just as an example, when I go downstairs, this knee sort of, I don't know quite how it does it, but the sensors in the foot plate and in the knee know that I'm about to descend stairs. So I just have to lean into it, and it yields. So the knee bends at a very predictable speed. And a mechanical knee would just give way. So when you relearn that and you get used to it, it's almost impossible to go back to a mechanical knee. But more, more seriously, I can now. I used to carry when my kids were a bit younger, they're toddlers now, but when they were younger, I'd carry them down the stairs, and actually, it's quite a lot of trust in actually talking to the people who design the algorithm. And I talk about it a bit in the book. The sort of tolerances for how many mistakes you can let your algorithm make, or the unit make, is actually quite high, because one misstep in however many billion actually that results in people getting hurt, when they're going downstairs with their children potentially. So it's really interesting to find out about that in terms of the responsibility from these med tech companies. And so that was interesting to learn about as well.
Yeah. And I think especially from an engineering standpoint, there's the tolerance is quite, you really have to internalize how important that is to like the individual people that are sort of bearing the weight of the tolerance and any adjustment that you make in those tolerances.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Another thing that you talk about is, I'm wondering if you see there being any like disconnect between the expectations that we have on where technology is today and like the reality of where it is today.
Yeah, well, we talked a little bit about the sort of, as I walk down the street, people often stop me and they say, "Oh, how fast can you run?" Or "How can you jump higher than you used to?" Or "Can you run faster?" And I say, "No, I can't run at all." And it's sort of put a new knee on and a new set of feet. So I think there's that sort of that sort of slight disconnect about the sort of the popular sort of psyche of what this stuff is really like. I think there's two things that I'd say on it. There's sort of, I think things are changing a bit. Where I was looking at Star Wars, where sort of, and even so, I'm thinking of depictions in popular culture of disability where the baddies always used to be, the amputees or the disfigured people. Right. But you look at some new films where actually, the amputee who's Darth Vader in the early films, and then Skywalker in the amputees actually they're the good guys, and there's a few quite interesting sort of examples of where actually the technology is seen as hopeful and positive. I think the other side of that is that this thing, when you get given it and you buy it, it comes in a box. It's all grey. Like, it looks like buying a smartphone. This lovely box with sort of really beautifully packaged box that has a tagline like sort of "Find your limitless freedom" or something. Right. And that's quite interesting too, because as a user of it, you're sort of being sold something. You're being sold a certain dream essentially. And I can tell you, it doesn't give you back limitless freedom. I can tell you that. But so there's a sort of marketing competition going on for these sorts of devices as well. And I think as someone who's in the center of that, you sort of, there's always, and I've had a number of different bits of tech, and I've always got to the prosthetics center and thought, this is it. This is going to be the moment where, I will get a bit of equipment that's really going to change my life, and it's going to be much, much better. But actually the reality is that, you're still an amputee. It's still hard work. And don't get me wrong, these bits of kit are amazing and it is hopeful, but there's still this slight sort of disappointment when you realize that actually you're not able-bodied again, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And I think it kind of goes back to that point earlier that you were mentioning about how it's sort of a technology that's embedded within this system, and that system has its own sort of set of goals and ambitions, and part of it is kind of selling this leg over a different leg and things like that. How?
So I was just saying the other side of that is, I've often been in a prosthetics department and been waiting for a bit of kit like this that costs thousands and thousands of pounds, and for whatever reason the person next to me can't access it because they weren't blown up, or they've got a slightly different funding pot, or their insurance is slightly different. And when it's a 6-year-old kid who had meningitis or something, that's quite strange, because you sort of think, well, why aren't they able to access the same technology as me? So I think the inequality within, and there's inequality in all technology, as we all know, but within the sort of med tech industry, it's quite interesting that still exists. And then when you look at other countries where there's none of this, and there's 20 million people, they reckon, worldwide who need a wheelchair but can't afford one. There's lots of sort of, I think I butchered that stat, but anyway, there's a lot of people worldwide who need a wheelchair but can't sort of access one. So I think as a user, that's also quite strange to see that inequality, and I happen to have been a soldier and be able to access some of the best kit around. and that's not the same for anyone, for everyone.
Yeah. Yeah, and it is quite interesting that, as you mentioned, like the way that you have like acquired your injury is through being a soldier, and even like the moment of the injury, being on a battlefield and being embedded within this system of really like well practiced and like well honed medical technology and medical professionals and processes. It really changed the way that you sort of started on this journey. And even I think you mentioned in the book, it's really the only situation where that could have happened and you would have survived that initial trauma. How much has like the system of being a soldier who's been injured impacted like the entire journey of what you can do and the types of support that you get and even like the way that people view you and your injury?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question. I mean, just in terms of, in the book, I'd write about the fact that I could have been injured almost anywhere in this country, even right outside a central London hospital,
Right.
and not survived. But because in Afghanistan, where we were, we had a British and American base with the best medical trauma equipment all in one place. And critically, we had a load of surgeons and doctors who were all on standby in a room right next door. So when you got injured, and actually I was picked up by helicopter, Pedro helicopter that just happened to be flying over, picked me up, took me back in 17 minutes. And when you think of it in London, even if you were outside the hospital, it'd probably take you 17 minutes to get through the hospital. But so those sorts of the technologies of survival, and I include in that things like the bit of blood clotting powder that they put into my leg, and also the helicopter that flew me across the desert. That's quite amazing, really, as someone who's sort of survived that. And I think it's just sort of, your question was about the sort of journey with that in mind, but also I think there's something, and I don't think it's always positive, and I talk about this a bit in the book about sort of embarrassment and being ashamed. But when I was first injured, I was very embarrassed that I was the one who'd been injured, and all the people I'd served with were still, walking around. They could go back and soldier and do their job, and I felt very embarrassed by the fact that I was the one who'd stepped on the bomb. And it's sort of, people say that's mad, it's just luck, but actually being a good soldier is half about being lucky. So, but I think actually through my recovery, that the military teaches you to be sort of quite hard on yourself in a sense, and to achieve the mission essentially. So I think in my recovery, and I think a lot of people who've been in the military will probably say the same, is when you're going through rehab or something, you have that sort of training to fall back on. That sort of, I will do this even if it's uncomfortable. And I think also that sort of baseline of physical health and that sort of physical fitness that we all had also helped the recovery. But I think that sort of hard-edged and not being vulnerable, in the end, it was two-edged. There was some disadvantages to it essentially, because I think if you're just, if you're not vulnerable and you're a disabled person, that you don't open yourself up to the rest of society and all these amazing networks. So that was an interesting journey to go on, I think.
Right. And was that something that you kind of felt that you specifically had to like overcome, this like mindset or like culture of like, oh, this is like my burden and I'm going to like get through it, and it doesn't involve anybody else almost?
Yeah, I think I had to sort of, over time, I had to learn to be less sort of like man up and grow a pair, and all these sort of quite macho, male-dominated sort of sayings that, in hindsight, and I could understand why we had them. You're going into war. You need these quite sort of, you need these things to sort of bond you as a team, and also achieve those very difficult things you needed to achieve. But actually, when you're recovering, just going for it all the time, not letting your body necessarily rest and heal how it should, can become a little bit of a disadvantage. So I think over time I've learned to sort of slightly moderate it. Might be to do with age as well. I think we become a bit more chilled out as we get older.
Yeah, that makes sense. I wanted to jump to, we have a couple of audience questions that I wanted to ask you. So the first one is from Vint, who asks, any thoughts about cochlear implants in the context of the hybrid human concept? And they go on to say, I have been wearing hearing aids for 65 years and am totally dependent on batteries to hear. My wife has cochlear implants as well.
Yeah, it's a really, I mean, I think that there's some amazing books and articles about cochlear implants, but I looked at them in the book because I was very interested in the people who are who have the sort of pioneers of technologies, and this idea that we now have a technology that can repair a sense. To me, felt, we sort of take it for granted. 600,000 people have cochlear implants in the world, but actually, for me, it's an incredible technology. It's sort of crossed the chasm, and it's now out there, and lots of people have them. But at the beginning, there were people who had to experiment with stuff. They had to have electrodes into their they had to be willing to have surgery in order to have cochlear implants, and this was 50, 60 years ago. And I think those sort of pioneers, that was a very interesting thing for me to research, to look at these people who were sort of fighting really hard to overcome their disabilities. Because although I have fought quite hard, I'm also, I don't overdo it. I'm not always researching different things. It's not sort of, it's more measured for me. But I think with the cochlear implants, what was so interesting about it for me was also that there was a group of, and I'm sure the person listening will probably know more about this than I do, but it was so interesting that actually these technologies aren't always seen as positive by the people that they're for. And in the deaf community, there was a large group that felt that the cochlear implant was essentially ethnocide, and they were getting rid of a language, American Sign Language, and that by giving especially young people cochlear implants before the age of consent, there was, in a sense, they were disrupting their support networks potentially, and the people that they could then go on to be part of a community. And if that community died, what did that mean? And I think that goes across a lot of different disabilities in terms of, and it goes into a part of the book that we haven't really talked about, which is about whether we should be trying to sort of eradicate disability, or how far we go to make a normal body. And I think there was part of my recovery that was, I was always comparing myself to other people on YouTube about different legs. I always wanted a better and more, an upgrade essentially to make myself more normal. Right. But what would it be to just accept the disability and allow society to accept me how I am? And I think with other disabilities, that's more profound somehow. Actually, lower limb amputee is I think it's probably one of the easier sort of biomechanical problems to solve, because it's it's all in one plane. Actually upper limb much more difficult, and then the senses, senses, eyesight seems very tricky.
Yeah, and you kind of touched upon it there, but there's also this culture that develops around certain disabilities, like deafness in particular, where it has its own language and it has its own sort of patterns and social factors. Do you see that emerging as well, like in lower amputees, or even various different types of amputees, or not as much?
Not as, I don't think as much. I mean, I think with the deaf community, I think there's a sign language, there's a language, there's communities around that, and I feel, although there are communities around sort of amputees and support groups and things like that that are really powerful, it doesn't feel sort of quite so profound to me anyway. That would be my sort of feeling on it.
Yeah. Yes, we have another question from Hugh, who asks, you talk about the integration of how technology has enhanced your physical state post your injuries. What are your thoughts on how technology can assist in aiding the psychological journey as well?
Yeah, I think that's really, I talk a little bit about sort of PTSD in the book, and I actually talk about post-traumatic growth, which some people might know about, and we've done a lot of research on PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, because it's obviously a big problem, but we haven't really done so much on post-traumatic growth. And of course, it turns out that post-traumatic growth is far more common. If you go through something very traumatic, often humans feel growth out of that for whatever reason. And that's certainly my experiences. Even though I went through something very traumatic, I never had PTSD. And actually, I've often met people who find that hard to understand. They sort of think, well, you stepped on a bomb, surely you have PTSD. I have to say, well, no, I don't. And it's a sort of it's a medical thing that you can sort of diagnose, and I've never had it. But what I have had is I feel much more sort of hopeful and have much more self-worth, I think, about my life than I did before I was injured, potentially. And I wouldn't change what happened to me either. I think people find that quite hard to sort of grapple with. But then I think at the same time, we all have that sense, sort of quite in lots of cultures, the idea that sort of good things often come out of bad things is something that we can sort of understand. And we can sort of, I think it's a sort of cultural, runs in lots of cultures, that idea that something good can come out of something bad. But I do think the sort of technologies that I've had have really helped that growth, because they've allowed me to recover, to get up, to interact with the world, to commute to work, to have a normal job. So I do think that technologies in that sense help with the psychology of being disabled. I suspect that the question is more about, the actual, the sort of brain injuries and psychological traumas and things. And I'm not an expert on this, but there are things that technologies can help with in terms of, helping people with things like PTSD. And then there's research on things like VR environments and other sort of ways of, technologies and programs that help people overcome those sorts of traumas. I also think that just having things like social networks can really help people connect in a very simple sense. And I think one of the slight errors that the British Army made was try to keep all the sort of amputees together in the army, because they felt that was the right thing to do. But actually what happened was everyone just sort of got a bit annoyed that they couldn't still soldier. And what was a better idea was to send them out into new communities and back into the communities of the country, and to become useful assets to those communities. And I do think, the way we're all connected now really helps with that.
Yeah. And because I think this also goes back to kind of like the universal uses of technology, but even things like people starting to use Zoom during the pandemic, and presumably that has an impact on like people who have more difficulty with mobility and being able to jump on a Zoom call and do things with people in a way that they maybe couldn't have before.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, there's quite a few examples of disability choirs of different, vulnerable people before the pandemic who used to connect with video conferencing very regularly. So in a sense, they were again, and it's so often the case that the disability communities were sort of, in a sense, trialing out some of these technologies before, they sort of come into the community.
Yeah. And I think that also raises an interesting point about like the structure that medical technology has, where the people who are trialing these things and sort of on the cutting edge of these things are people with disabilities, or often like soldiers in your situation. Does that create any like concerns, you think, or like in the way that we go about developing these things and adopting these things?
Sorry, Matt, can you just repeat the start of the question? Sorry.
Yeah, absolutely. So I was just thinking that the people who are sort of on the front line of testing these things, almost like the guinea pigs in these situations, are people with disabilities or people in these very extraordinary situations. But if the goal is to kind of create almost like a universal accessibility, is there like a disconnect between those two approaches, you think, or not really?
Yeah, well, I think, we're looking at things like going back to Elon Musk and the Neuralink, the only people who've had brain-computer interfaces are people with sort of locked-in syndrome or ASL. And in that case, they're the only people who are sort of damaged enough, if you like, to have the risks of putting an electrode onto the cortex of the brain in order for them to try and control a mouse on the screen to write with, or to use a robotic arm to help them to feed. And it is incredible technology. And actually, I look at someone in the book, a French person called Thibault, who had an exoskeleton that was controlled with a brain-computer interface. And he was paralyzed. He's a young guy, and he was up for being that guinea pig. We're talking about. Right. But I think you never know. In 50 years' time, the exoskeleton could be the sort of the wheelchair of the future, they'll be everywhere, and allowing people to interact in the world in a way that's far more accessible, essentially. So we'll see, but I do think that there is a slight tension about sort of using, or not using, but these people are sort of having, but in a sense they are these sort of explorers. That's the way I think of it.
Yeah, that makes sense. So we're just about out of time. Harry, I want to thank you again for joining us. It's been such an amazing honor having this discussion with you.
Oh, thanks, Matt. It's been great. It's been really fun to chat through.
Yeah. Harry's book, Hybrid Humans, is available now wherever books are sold, including through your local and independent bookseller. It's a very profound and inspiring read, and I genuinely recommend everyone check it out. For everyone who joined us today, we look forward to seeing you at our next Talks at Google event. Take care.